Chris Eubank Jr. grew up with a rich father, a famous father. You have to imagine that he didn't really want for much growing up, lived in a mansion and so on and so forth. And as a fighter in the pros, Eubank Jr. has had some big paydays, most notably against George Groves in the World Boxing Super Series, also against James DeGale, etc., etc. And we've seen him. This is a guy who likes to show off the stuff he has on his social media. We've seen him in his big mansion down there in Brighton on the South Coast. We've seen his designer clothes and flashy watches and all this kind of thing. The reason I'm talking about all this is because Eubank Jr. curiously seems to be very keen on this Jake Paul fight. Why would he be so, insistent about pursuing Jake Paul, who isn't a fighter as credentialed as Eubank Jr. and isn't a fighter as credentialed as the opponents Eubank Jr. should be fighting, right? His contemporaries in the middleweight division. But yet he keeps on talking about fighting Jake Paul. He says he'll step in because of the fact that the Hasim Rahman fight has fallen through. He'll step in and replace Hasim Rahman. And he says Jake Paul can come in at whatever weight he wants. And of course, that's going to be a lot bigger than Eubank Jr. What's this all about? Is it about a bag for Eubank Jr. purely? Has he actually given up on the dream of becoming a world champion and is now just focused on prize fighting, making as much money as possible while he's here and able to do so, while he's still healthy and relatively young? Is that all boxing is now about for Chris Eubank Jr.? Has he lost his ambition to some extent? You guys let me know what you think in the comments below, because Myris Breedis, the now former cruiserweight champion, recently lost to Jay Opataya. He was also pursuing Jake Paul. And with a guy like Myris Breedis who's pushing 40, it really did look like just a money grab for him. Why else would he want to fight the guy? These guys may be coming to the ends of their careers and they're feeling like that's an easy payday. It's almost like a WWE type thing. I'm not saying it wouldn't be I'm not saying that Jake Paul's fights aren't real. I think they are real in the sense that they're not fixed or scripted or whatever. I don't think they're like Mickey Rourke's fights, for example. If you go and look at Mickey Rourke fighting, those fights were fixed, scripted fights, right? But with Jake Paul, I don't get that sense. So, is it just all about the money for Eubank Jr.? And will he now no longer even bother looking at the world champions, the Charlos? Apparently, I heard somebody say that Charlo called out Eubank Jr. recently. And if that's the case, watch one of my subscribers show me a video that I've done about it recently. I do so many videos, I forget what I've spoken about half the time. But if he has been called out by Charlo, well, he better answer that call. He better go and do that fight. He was also called out by Demetrius Andrade, who said he'd fight Eubank Jr. for $1 million. But Eubank Jr. at the moment seems more interested in Conor Benn, who's a welterweight, right? And that also lends credence to this idea that Eubank Jr. is just looking for money at this point. He doesn't even really care that much about titles, because the Conor Benn fight is a money fight. Yeah, it's a legacy fight to some degree. Their dads had a rivalry and whatever. But I think I suspect a lot of it is just down to money. So you guys let me know what you think in the comments below. Eubank Jr. pursuing Conor Benn for money, pursuing Jake Paul for money. And Conor Benn actually responded to Eubank Jr. calling out Jake Paul and said that Eubank Jr. has lost his pen, which is interesting. But I have to figure that Eubank Jr. thinks that the Jake Paul fight will get him more exposure, and with exposure comes money. So maybe there's a strategic element to it as well. Maybe it's not just the money, but in the United States, if he was to go in there and beat Jake Paul, then all of a sudden the casuals in America are like, oh, wow, this Eubank Jr. guy, can he fight for a middleweight title? Do you know what I mean? That kind of thing. Maybe that would gain him. In fact, I'm sure it would gain him more respect stateside than beating a Conor Benn. even though Conor Benn's a real fighter, in the United States, people don't really know Conor Benn like that. Not as much as they know Jake Paul. And so, again, we're talking about the casual audience here. The casual audience are going to sit up and take notice if Eubank Jr. manages to get in there and beats Jake Paul. If he beats a welterweight in Conor Benn in Britain, I mean, nobody in the States is going to care. They're just going to look at that and say, you beat a welterweight. Who was he anyway? What's he ever done even in the welterweight division? Now, of course, you could certainly argue that they should be saying the same thing if he was to beat a Jake Paul. You beat a YouTuber. What does that mean? The casual fans don't see it that way. You know what I mean? And that's how ultimately you become financially successful, and how you manage to get a lot of opportunities is by capturing the imagination of the casual fans, of the casual market. That's where you're really going to make your money. And that's how you can actually elevate your commercial value to such a degree that, well, of course, the champions are more keen on fighting you because it's a payday, and you may get better offers to fight a champion like Demetrius Andrade than $1 million. It might be $2, $3, $4 million if you're coming off this high-profile fight against Jake Paul where you won. You see it. Anyway, like I say, let me know what you guys think about the whole thing in the comment section below.